Good morning, everyone. Welcome to My Jewish Learning, Daily Dose of Talmud, Daf Yomi, Week in Review. We have a switcheroo this week. I'm going to teach the class, and my colleague Ben Harris is going to facilitate for us. So you're stuck with me again. Ben, have we got our folks filed in from the waiting room? Are we here?
Looks like we got most folks here, a couple stragglers, but we can get
Okay.
going.
All right. So if you just walked in, I'm Rachel Scheinerman. I edit My Jewish Learning. This is Daf Yomi Week in Review. And this week, it turns out that the material lined up nicely because from last Thursday to this Thursday is about one chapter of Talmud, and it is chapter 12 of Tractate Yevamot, which is Chalitza week. It's all about Chalitza. Chalitza, of course, is the ritual whereby a levirate bond is dissolved. We learned earlier in the tractate, we talked a little bit about the strength of the levirate bond, that it has legal strength. So if a man dies childless and then his widow is bonded to his brother, that bond means she can't just go marry somebody else. We have to sever the bond before she can do that to free her up. So we have discussed cases in which chalitza might happen, but this week is all about how does it happen? What is the ritual that is necessary to effectively sever the levirate bond? How do we do chalitza properly? And that's very important to make sure that she's free to go and marry others as she wishes. And I sort of switch up the format when I teach this and try different things. I'm going to do that again this week, and I always appreciate your feedback on the format. Let me know if it works for you. What I'm thinking, what we're going to do today, instead of marching straight through the Talmud, page by page, we're going to do sort of an archaeology. We're going to start with the Torah, then we're going to move to the Mishnah, then we're going to move to the Gemara. So we're going to look at the chronological layers and see how those fit together in this week's material. And it's a good week to do that because everything about Chalitza stems from just a few verses in Deuteronomy. Everything is basically a discussion of these few verses in Deuteronomy, so we can see how the conversation builds through the generations. I'm going to focus largely on the Mishnah today because it's pretty rich, and the Gemara is doing very much similar things to the Mishnah. Sometimes it's not, but this week it's kind of doing very similar things. So we're going to focus on the Mishnah, and then we'll talk about what the Gemara does next. And then at the very end, we're going to focus on one of these sort of amazingly wild Gemara tangents that the rabbis go on this week, the one I thought was the most interesting. We brought it in the piece we did on Yevamot 103, but we didn't have time in that piece to really look very thoroughly at it and see how the rabbis get on that tangent and how the whole text works. So that's the plan for today. We're going to do Torah, Mishnah, Gemara tangent in half an hour. Okay, so buckle up. Here we go. I've got a source sheet, and I'm going to ask my colleague Ben to. I've put it in the chat as a Google Doc, so you can open a window on your computer to look at. But Ben, would you also put it on the screen so that folks can follow there as well? Okay, so let's go. Let me get all my screens arranged so I can see everything I need to see. All right. So everything the rabbis know about Chalitza comes from these four verses of Torah, Deuteronomy 25, 7 through 10. The widow goes to the elders of the gate of the city, and she declares, "My husband's brother refuses to establish a name in Israel for his brother. He will not perform the duty of a Yavam." The brother-in-law is then summoned, and if he indeed refuses to marry her, the widow pulls off his sandal from his foot. The word there is raglo, which literally means leg also, so that'll be important later. She pulls off his sandal, she spits in his face, and three things: pulls off his sandal, spits in his face, and proclaims, "Thus shall be done to the man who will not build up his brother's house." This procedure releases the brother from his obligation, but from then on, he and his household are referred to as the family of the unsandaled one. Okay, so this is everything that the Torah says about the procedure of chalitza, and there's a lot to discuss here, right? who are these elders at the gates? It doesn't say judges, it says elders. Whenever the Torah says elders, that's a little confusing exactly what it means. Notice that it's a very public location. It's meant to cause possibly some embarrassment. I always wonder reading this and knowing that the word here used for feet is so often used as a euphemism for genitalia in the Bible. If this is sort of symbolically, she grabs him by the balls, basically, right? You're not using these right, and I'm going to let everybody know. There's this idea of lingering dishonor. Okay, so this is the procedure. Now, the Mishnah is going to do what the rabbis of the Mishnah do, and they're going to ask exactly what all of these things mean. So there are, I believe, 6 Mishnayot on this particular passage. So let's go ahead and we're just going to work through them fairly quickly. Okay, so Mishnah 1. The mitzvah of chalitza must be performed before 3 judges, even if all are 3 laymen. So ideally we have 3 dayanim, 3 people who are qualified judges. That's already different from elder, but it will work, the rabbis say, even if they're not rabbinic judges. If she performed chalitza with a leather shoe, remember that the Torah says sandal. If she does it with a leather shoe, though, her chalitza is valid. But if he was wearing a soft shoe, which probably means made of cloth, then her chalitza is invalid. If a sandal that has a heel, valid, but without a heel, invalid. So the rabbis are working out the footwear here. And the Gemara will continue to work out the footwear, what exactly this means. Okay, Mishnah 2. Ben, I'm not monitoring the comments, by the way, so well, because I'm sort of focused on this. So if there's something I should know, feel free to let me know, okay, Ben? Mishnah 2. If a sandal that did not belong to him, or a sandal made of wood, or on the left, which was on his right foot, I guess he put his left sandal on his right foot, all of those things still are valid. He doesn't have to own the sandal. It can be made out of wood. It can be on the wrong foot. It's still valid. If she performed chalitza on a shoe that's too large for him, but he can still walk in it, they're kind of clowny size shoes, but he can still walk, it still works, or a shoe that was too small, but at least it covered most of his foot, then it counts as a piece of footwear that works for this procedure. Her chalitza is valid. If a woman performed chalitza at night, her chalitza is valid, but Rabbi Elazar disagrees. He invalidates it. And if she performed chalitza on the left foot, her chalitza is invalid, but again, Rabbi Elazar disagrees. I'm sorry. If she did it on the left foot, her chalitza is invalid, but in this case, Rabbi Elazar says, actually, it is valid. Okay, so we're working out all the details of what kind of footwear, and it seems to have to do with size and how well it fits and how functional it is for walking, and also which foot it's on. There's a concern. Most of the rabbis think if it's on the left foot, it doesn't count, but Rabbi Elazar thinks that is okay. All right, Mishnah number 3. If she removed the shoe and spat, but did not recite the necessary text, her chalitza is valid. Remember, there were 3 steps: shoe, spitting, reciting. And they're saying if she does the first 2 but not the third, good enough. She doesn't have to say the text, as long as she does the shoe and the spitting. If she recited the text and the spat but did not remove the shoe, her chalitza is disqualified. So the shoe is an essential part of this ritual, even if the text apparently isn't. If she removed the shoe and recited the text but did not spit, okay, that's a third option. The first was that she didn't recite the text. The second was that she didn't remove the shoe. And now the third one is she forgot to spit. Rabbi Elazar says her chalitza is disqualified, but Rabbi Akiva says her chalitza is valid. Okay, now they're going to argue. Rabbi Elazar said to him, hey, the verse states, so shall be done to the man who does not build his brother's house. See the word so? It's referring to the action. Therefore, any term that constitutes an action for chalitza is indispensable, right? That word so, which is referring back to an action, means we need to do both actions, which means we also need to spit, which was one of the actions. And Rabbi Akiva said to him, what? You derive your proof from there? But doesn't it state, so shall be done to the man, indicating that only a term constituted an action toward the man. Steinsaltz explains, namely, any aspect of chalitza that concerns the man's body, such as the removal of his shoe, is indispensable, but spitting, which is not specific to a part of the man's body, although it takes place in his presence, is not indispensable. Okay, I should have underlined man here. So they focus on different parts of the verse. Rabbi Elazar says the so means both actions are necessary, and Rabbi Akiva says the man means that the only action that's necessary is the one that's specifically performed on his body. General spitting in his direction doesn't count. Okay, and notice that just like the Gemara, the Mishnah is full of these discussions and doesn't always give us the answer, which is why we need the Gemara. Of course, the Gemara doesn't always give us the answer either, but that's another story. That's why we need the medieval law codes, right? Okay, let's move on. Now, what if you have something physical about you that means it might be hard to perform some of these functions, right? For instance, Mishnah number 5. If she performed chalitza on one of them, if she performed chalitza and one of them, meaning one of the judges or elders or whoever's, witnessing this event, is found to be a relative or disqualified for some other reason, her chalitza is invalid. Okay, generally speaking, when we have somebody in a judicial position, they can't judge a relative. We consider them not impartial, right? So if you have a witness in court, my brother can't serve as a witness for me because we assume he has a partiality toward me. So the question is, in the situation of chalitza, if the elders at the gate are her relatives, does that invalidate them? And the Mishnah seems to think no, but seem to think yes, that invalidates it. But Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yochanan the cobbler, they validate. They think it's okay if one of the judges is her relative or disqualified as a judge for some other reason. And remember, of course, in the first Mishnah, they weren't even sure it needs to be a judge. So, but these requirements are not just for judges, they're also the kind of requirements we have for witnesses. So there's a little slippage here. Okay? And an incident, and now we get a quick story. An incident occurred involving a certain person who performed chalitza between him and her alone in prison. Okay, here's an unusual situation. You're supposed to do chalitza at the city gates, but what if, this man dies and her brother-in-law is in prison? He can't come to the city gates to do this. They still want to break the levirate bond. And so they had to go do it privately in prison without the elders around. This is a very unusual circumstance. And what we find is that Rabbi Akiva validated that chalitza. He understood the circumstances and permitted it to be considered valid, even though we didn't have these elders or judges or whoever they are watching. Okay, one more Mishnah, and then we'll have done the whole Mishnah for the week. The mitzvah of chalitza is performed as follows. He and his yivama come to the court, and the scholars of the court give him advice appropriate for him. Now, I've interpolated Steinsaltz here because it's a little confusing. He says the advice is whether to enter levirate marriage or perform chalitza. So now the rabbis are describing how the ritual goes, and they say that really, even before we do this whole business at the gate, the two of them need to come to court and get advised by advisors. As it is stated, how do we know they need this advising? And the elders of the city shall call him and speak to him. That's what the speak to him is. That's a moment of advising for this couple. If they decide to perform chalitza, she says, and here's the line from Deuteronomy, my brother-in-law refused to establish a name for his brother in Israel. He did not want to consummate the levirate marriage. And afterward, he says to her, also from Deuteronomy, I do not wish to take her. And they would say these statements in the sacred language. Okay, so now we saw above that there was a thought that maybe only the actions matter, and if they don't say the statements, that's okay. Here, the rabbis are saying they need to say them, and they need to say them exactly as they appear in the Torah in Hebrew. Most Jews in the time of the Mishnah, if I'm not mistaken, the lingua franca at that point is moving to Aramaic. A lot of them are speaking Aramaic, and they're saying, no, you got to say it. And some Jews speak Greek. You have to say it in Hebrew. You have to say it exactly as the Torah says. So that's kind of interesting. And then his Yivam, now we quote Deuteronomy again, his Yivamah shall approach him before the elders, remove his shoe from on his foot, and spit before him. And they say the spit has to be visible to the judges. Got to be a nice big wad, okay? Got to be able to see that the spit happened, not just, I guess, hear it. And she shall respond to him and say, this is also straight from the text, so shall be done to the man who will not build up his brother's house. Up until this point, the judges would prompt the parties to recite the text. Okay, so the judges can help them if they don't know their lines. All right, and when Rabbi Hyrcanus once prompted the participants in Chalitza under an Ela tree in the village of Etam, he prompted them to finish reciting the whole Torah passage, after which they established the custom of completing the whole Torah passage. Therefore, they continued and said the whole verse, and his name shall be called in Israel the house of he who had his shoe removed. Apparently, there was a custom of not saying that part out loud, but Rabbi Hyrcanus, at least in this particular case, did use the whole verse, and then that became the custom. The mitzvah of saying, the house of he who has his shoe removed applies to the judges, but not to the students. Rabbi Huda says it is a mitzvah upon all those present to say he had his shoe removed. So there's a disagreement about under what circumstances we use the full formula in the Torah. If this part needs to be spoken aloud, is it only with judges or is it with anyone present? Okay, so the Mishnah did what it did. What it often does. It explains in further detail what is going on in the text. It tries to understand a little more, and in the process, it has raised as many questions as it has solved, which is so typical of the Mishnah. It takes this little ritual that's described in the Torah, and it elaborates on it, and it starts raising and solving questions about whether what kind of shoe, and whether we need to do all three aspects of the ritual and this and that. And it ends up solving, but also raising more questions, which is why we need the Gemara. And that's a lot of what we spent time in this week in the pieces that we read and studied together over the listserv. So instead of reviewing all that in detail, I will just note that some of the things we discussed in the pieces this week were things like, well, how many judges are really required? Is it 3? Is it 5? And the rabbis sort of decide that 3 is the minimum, but 5 would be better because we want sort of maximum exposure and maximum embarrassment to this guy. And then we had more details about the kind of shoe. We looked at that in some of the material we sent through this week. What about sandals with, here we saw, is it wood? Is it soft? Is it too big? Is it too large? In the Gemara, they start asking, what if it's a sandal with laces? What if it's a sandal of the Arab make, which seems to be a more tight-fitting sandal? I don't know exactly what that looks like. Is it a sandal with rings? Is it a sandal secured with straps? And it seemed like the rabbis were getting around to the idea that it needs to be something that you have to actually work to remove. It has to really be on the foot, and she has to really take it off. So like maybe flip-flops would be not good enough, right? Then there's more on the question of whether she can do it on the left foot. The rabbis in the Gemara decide that's okay. Then the rabbis, there's a whole discussion about what if he's an amputee? What if he doesn't have a foot, right? That comes up. Or what if he's club-footed, meaning his foot is turned around backward and he wears like a special prosthetic in that case? What if she has no arm? What if when she spits, what comes out is blood instead of saliva? All these kind of questions are raised in the Gemara. Some of them are answered, some of them are not. And we discussed a lot of them together, or we read through a lot of them together in the pieces that My Jewish Learning published this week. Okay, so that's sort of a snapshot of everything we've done this week and the project that the rabbis have built. They've taken this ritual in Deuteronomy and they keep asking questions about it and clarifying exactly how it needs to be done. And some of them get solved and some of them remain open. Now, I would like to just take the last 10 minutes that we have together, and I promised you a rabbinic digression because those are often wild and crazy, and this one is definitely wild and crazy, and we discussed it on 103, and I thought we might want to spend a little time together, and that is the question of when Deuteronomy says she takes it off his foot, it uses the word raglo, from the word regel, which in modern Hebrew means either a foot or a leg. And the rabbis also are not exactly, and I think that's true in ancient Hebrew as well, and the rabbis are not exactly sure if she can remove something from the upper portion of his leg. So there's a whole discussion about what exactly is his foot. And so here, let's take a look at some of the texts that are brought on 103. Now we're reading Gemara. It says, from the knee and above, the chalitza is invalid. Okay, so if it's something around his thigh, that doesn't count. Rav Kahana raised an objection from the verse. Okay, and against her afterbirth that emerges from between her legs, which is also nearby in Deuteronomy. Okay, this is describing a placenta that's been delivered after delivery, and it's described as emerging from between ragleha, okay, and we all know where that's coming out. It's high up. So clearly ragleha can refer to the thighs as well, right? That's Rav Kahana's contention. But Abaye says, actually, the verse means between her feet, because when a woman crouches to give birth, she pushes her heels into her thighs and she gives birth, so it appears that the fetus emerges from between her feet, right? You can imagine in the ancient world, they're not lying in a hospital bed to give birth, and a very, I guess, ergonomic, is that the correct word? An optimal position for giving birth is actually squatting on the ground with your heels on the ground and your knees up. That's a good position to put the pelvis in a position to enable the baby to come out. And you can imagine if a woman is squatting in this position, it looks like the baby's coming out from right between the feet. So Rav Kahana is saying, nope, your verse does not prove that regel means the top half of the leg. It still could just mean the feet. Okay, so we're going to try again. Come and hear another verse. He had neither dressed his feet nor his raglav, nor trimmed his beard in 2 Samuel. This is talking about someone who is still quite young and does not have a beard or pubic hair, right? So remember I said earlier that the raglav can be a euphemism for the genitalia. It's common. It's maybe what's going on in the previous verse too. And so the Gemara says, yeah, this is a euphemism. We can't learn from this that in the chalitza passage, the rabbis also mean the upper parts of the legs. Okay, so we're going to try again. Come and hear from another verse. And Saul went to go cover his feet. This also is one of those euphemistic passages. It means he went to go take a leak. And the Gemara says, no, that's a euphemism. That is also not going to prove to us that she can remove something from the upper portion of his legs and do a valid chalitza. All right, there's another one, but you get the idea. There are a bunch of these. So I'm going to move us down a little bit past the ellipses. The Gemara attempts another proof from a verse regarding Sisera's encounter with Yael. Okay, so remember that in Judges, Sisera is a general that is threatening Israel, and Yael saves Israel by going into him, seducing him, and killing him. Wahoo! Okay, and then it's good. So it says, at her feet he sunk, he fell. And the rabbis read this to indicate, again, the feet is indicating that they had a sexual relationship. And it implies that feet here, ragleha, the same word, means the thigh. And the Gemara says, this too is a euphemism. Okay, we have completely failed to prove that she can remove something from the upper portion of his leg and affect a chalitza. We've failed to prove that in Deuteronomy, regel means the upper portion of the leg. But as long as we're talking about Sisera and Yael and their encounter, suddenly the rabbis want to talk about that. Here's the digression that I promised you was coming. So Rabbi Yochanan said, that wicked man Sisera had sexual intercourse with Yael 7 times that day. Didn't you know? As it said, at her feet he sunk, he fell, he lay. At her feet he sunk, he fell. Where he sunk, there he fell down dead. Did you catch all this? Sunk, fell, lay, sunk, fell, 7. Okay. And so then now filled with this image in their heads, the rabbis ask, but how could Yael do this, even for the noble purpose of killing Sisera? Wow, how could she have sex with him 7 times? Yuck, right? Okay, as she derived pleasure from the transgression of a licentious sexual relations with a Gentile. Like, how could she do this 7 times with him? How could she do it? Did she enjoy it? This is really bothering them. Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, every act that is a benefit for the wicked is a disadvantage for the righteous. In other words, don't worry, she didn't have a good time. Let me give you my proof that anything that benefits the wicked is not pleasurable for the righteous, as it is stated by God to Lavan being the uncle of Jacob, who tricked him out of marrying his beloved Rachel. Right? That Lavan, it says, take heed to yourself that you speak not to Jacob either good or bad. Granted, speak no bad. This is rightly so, understandable. Well, why did he say speak no good to Jacob? Why did he say that to Lavan? Rather, learn from here that even something that would be good and benefit the wicked, like Lavan, is disadvantageous for the righteous. Okay, so this is Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai's proof that anything that's good for the wicked is not enjoyed by the righteous. So Yael couldn't possibly have enjoyed the 7 times she lay with Sisera. Okay, now the Gemara says, granted there, that is in Lavan's words to Jacob, it is understandable that there would be a certain repulsive aspect to a wicked man speaking nicely to a righteous individual. We get it there, as perhaps he will mention to him the name of an idol, right? What else would Lavan be talking about but an idol he worships? And even though he means well, it would still repulse Jacob. But here, with Yael and Sisera, what disadvantage is there? In other words, why shouldn't she enjoy sex with him? Maybe she should be allowed to enjoy sex with him. She's still doing the right thing for Israel. She's seducing him. She's going to kill him. Why does it bother us if she had a good time? Okay. So the Gemara answers, and this is the text that we discussed in the piece that we shared. And it was Sarah Ronis's piece, Dr. Sarah Ronis's piece. Because he implants his filth in her. Rabbi Yochanan also said, when the serpent came upon Eve, he infected her with moral contamination, and the Jewish people stood at Mount Sinai. And when the Jewish people stood at Mount Sinai, their contamination ceased, whereas with regard to the Gentiles who did not stand at Mount Sinai, their contamination never ceased. Why do we know she didn't enjoy it or shouldn't enjoy it? Because Sisera, as a non-Jew, is somehow filled with filth. It comes out from him when he has sex with her, and then it fills her, and that's terrible. And how do we know that? Because when Eve had sex with the serpent in Genesis, she was filled with filth, and therefore that filth passed to all of humanity. This looks an awful lot like original sin. That's what Dr. Rodas was talking about. Until Sinai, when the act of revelation reversed that just for Israel, but the rest of humanity is still filled with that filth. And that's why she wouldn't have enjoyed sex with Sisera. So I've left us exactly 1 minute for discussing this complicated and more than slightly disturbing text. I think for us today, maybe it's not so hard to imagine that the rabbis really hate Sisera, right? He's destroying Israel, and so he's filthy. His semen is filthy, okay. But this idea that all of humanity was filled with filth from the serpent who had sex with Eve, and then it passed to all of humanity, and only Sinai and Revelation cleaned it out of the Jewish people, and the rest of the Gentiles still have it. Ooh, boy. Anyone want to comment? I've given no one a chance to get a word in edgewise here. Okay. I don't have a lot to comment, except to say what Dr. Rona said, which this does not seem to be a mainstream Jewish view. The Talmud has many views that do not become mainstream, and I'm pleased to report that it is not apparently mainstream Jewish view that there was some sort of original filth that infected all of humanity in the Garden of Eden, and that the Jews managed to find a way to wash themselves from it and nobody else did. So that's something of a relief to me. But okay, I see one hand. Ben, it's from iPhone. Wow, your parents really named you well. Ben, can we hear from iPhone?
iPhone, you can unmute right now if you want to ask a question.
Maybe they don't know they have their hand up.
Yeah, not happening.
All right. I think I'm going to call it there, Ben. We made it to 10. That's a quick overview of the week in Chalitza, and a little taste for how the text is put together chronologically. And we have only a week and a half left in this tractate, folks. So we'll see you next week for probably our last full review. Oh, yeah, here's the thing. Next week, we'll do a review of that week in Yevamot, and the following week, instead of this class on Thursday, we will have our siyum for the tractate, which will be at a different time. So we have one more week in review on Yevamot next week. I believe that's with Dr. Yardena Osmond. And the following week, please join us for the siyum instead of this class, and then we're on to Ketubot. Okay, all right. Thank you, everybody. It was nice to see you all. All right. Bye, everyone.